Well, I'm back. And I have some announcements to make. Our symposium is being broadcast live today. No pressure on the presenters. On Houston Media Source Television on Xfinity Channel 17. Inside the program, there is a form, and you all have it out there. You all got in part of your package includes a form on which you can write questions for the speakers to be answered during this afternoon's question and answer period. And if you haven't written down 3 or 4 questions for Juliana alone, I would be surprised. And then finally, and this is something that I try to remember to do religiously, and that is to silence my cell phone. So if you'll take a moment to check to make sure that it is silenced, you can do what I do now, and I try to keep it in my breast pocket so that when it vibrates, I know I've gotten something, but I'm not disturbing others. So please take a moment to check your cell phones. Our next presenter is a colleague from the University of North Texas, and Foster Todd Smith, or Todd as he likes to go by, is in the history department there and has written extensively on the Caddo, the Wichita, and he has a great survey of Indian, essentially that second half of the 18th and first half of the 19th century, and the book is very aptly titled From Dominance to Disappearance, in which he traces how the native peoples of what is today eastern Texas go from being in charge of the place in the middle of the 18th century to actually being expelled from Texas by the middle of the 19th century. And the process of that expulsion it has a lot to do with the attitudes, something that Juliana talked about, just how you see the place that you are coming in contact with and that you're coming to control as an outsider. He's presently got a brand new book that just came out a couple of months ago, and I haven't gotten around to it yet, but I'm going to run right out and get a copy for myself, even though I won't be able to read it for a few months because I've got other stuff going on. Louisiana and the Gulf South Frontier, 1500 to 1821. It just came out from LSU Press in November. He's also got working right now on something that will be out from the University of Oklahoma Press, Southwestern Indian Territory, for an anthology on the Indian Territory and the Indian peoples of the Indian Territory during the Civil War. So look for that. There's been a lot of work on the Civil War lately from all kinds of angles, and one of the ones that's been relatively neglected, so I'm glad to see this book come along, is the fact that the Indians, particularly the 5 civilized tribes, took sides during the Civil War, and a great deal of conflict took place in what we call Oklahoma today, but was Indian territory in the middle part of the 19th century. So paying attention to it, there are some really fascinating and heartbreaking stories there. So look forward to that. So Todd's presentation today easily picks up the story from Juliana, but from kind of an Anglo perspective, from an English perspective that gets transferred to the American westward experience. So it's how these Anglo-Americans view this new region that they're entering and what attitudes they brought with them, and how those attitudes, in fact, challenge what had been these Indian sovereignties that existed in this region. And so let's welcome Todd Smith.
Morning. Thank you all for coming today. I have to apologize right off the bat that I'm a sort of a Luddite who fears technology, so I don't have any slides, so you're gonna have to be stuck just listening to me rather than look at all those nice maps that Juliana put forth. Just try and remember those maps that were up there. In 1821, Spain lost a province in North America that bordered the United States. Located on the fringes of the Spanish New World Empire, far from the wealthy interior colonies of Mexico and Peru, the Spaniards never put much effort into developing this province's economy, choosing to populate it with Franciscan missionaries and soldiers, as the colony was mainly established for defensive and evangelical purposes. As a result, only a few thousand Hispanic Catholics lived in the province by the early 19th century, almost all of them residing in a few compact, disparate communities. On the other hand, powerful Native American groups dominated the colony's backcountry. Immediately after Spain gave up the province in 1821, English speakers, Anglos, nearly all of them Protestants from the United States, moved into the region along with their black slaves and began establishing commercial farms, raising cotton and a bit of sugar in the colony's rich, well-watered soil. Tensions soon developed with the province's original inhabitants, and warfare broke out in 1835, with the more numerous Anglo-Protestants ultimately prevailing. Consequently, the Anglos wrote a constitution, and the province entered the Union as a fully equal state in 1845. I was talking about Florida, but my point is that without changing one word of that paragraph, I could also have been speaking about Texas. For it is my contention that Texas, despite being part of Mexico after 1821, shares a similar, if not almost exactly the same history, at least during the antebellum era, through Reconstruction, as with the rest of the Gulf South, an area that I define that stretches from West Florida to East Texas, from the Suwannee River in Georgia and Florida, westward to the Brazos River here in Texas. It's a region where, between 1815 and 1840, Anglo-Protestants from the United States swept into the relatively uninhabited territory, removed the native inhabitants, and with their black slaves, established cash crop plantations. But this being Texas, and I know Texans think that Texas is exceptional, and I do too. I'll get to that in a minute. But you might say Texas is different because there was a revolution against the Hispanic Catholics that resulted in the creation of an independent republic. However, Anglo-Protestants in that part of Louisiana north of Lake Pontchartrain did the same thing a quarter of a century before the Texans did when they rose up against the Spaniards and created the West Florida Republic in 1810. One might point out that the Texans faced and defeated an invading army at San Jacinto that threatened to overturn their independence. The Anglo-Protestant inhabitants of the Gulf South did the exact same thing when they, with the help of French Creoles and free blacks of New Orleans, defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815. One could argue that unlike the short-lived West Florida Republic, Texas was on its own for 10 years. One could answer that during that period, the federal government was so weak that states such as Mississippi and Alabama were close to being independent republics as well. I don't mean to be a Texas basher here. I love Texas. My wife is from San Antonio. If I had a bumper sticker on my car, it would say I wasn't born in Texas, but I got here as soon as I could. I love Texas. Whereas my colleague at UNT, Mike Campbell, who I'm sure that most of you know or have heard of, insists that Texas today is still basically the same as Georgia or Arkansas or Alabama. I would say that at some point during the 20th century, their histories diverged and Texas did become distinct from the rest of the Deep South. Whether that occurred with the development of West Texas, an expansion of territory not afforded to the other Gulf South states except Florida, or with the establishment of the oil industry, ditto, or with the influx of Mexicans and other migrants during the course of the 20th century, I couldn't say. I just think that Texas is vastly different than Georgia today, and I'll leave it at that. However, during the antebellum period, the history of Texas is identical to its deep southern brethren, despite the international boundary, not only because it was settled by Anglo-Protestants who established Texas as a slave state and seceded as a group in following the 1860 presidential election of the Republican Abraham Lincoln, but also in its relations with the Indians that lived in the province. When I first started studying this subject, I thought that Texas was certainly different than, say, Georgia. It's west of the Mississippi River. It was a Spanish province, and it came under the dominion of Mexico for a while. Therefore, it has to be different when it comes to Indians. I also believe this because I was lazy and didn't want to look into the histories of Georgia and Alabama and their Indian relations. But I just published a book, shameless plug, entitled Louisiana and the Gulf South Frontier, 1500-1821. And in doing the research for this work, I found that I could no longer ignore the similarities. First, Texas east of the Brazos, which except for San Antonio and Austin was basically all there was to Texas in the antebellum era. Certainly before 1840, few Texans lived west of I-45, is environmentally similar with the rest of the Gulf South, as it is the westernmost extension of the Great Eastern Forest that stretches all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. I was reminded of this yesterday when I was driving down from Dallas. When I got about halfway here, I thought, am I on I-45 north of Houston, or am I on I-10 east of New Orleans and Mobile? It's the same forested environment that exists all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. The Gulf South region, including East Texas, is characterized by thick forests, a long growing season, and well-watered, extremely fertile soil that is one of the most productive agricultural sections in the world. As a result, the natives of the region, despite having different linguistic affiliations, developed the same Mississippian culture, characterized by intensive cultivation of corn, beans, and squash, large populations settled in towns, with a hierarchical political system headed by a hereditary elite. The same Mississippian culture the Indians developed all the way from West Georgia to East Texas. Ultimately, these tribes became known as, and I'm going to list them here, the Cherokees, Iroquoian speakers living in northwest Georgia by the late 18th century, the Creeks and Seminoles, eastern Muskogean speakers who resided in southwest Georgia, all of Alabama, and northern Florida, the Choctaws and Chickasaws, western Muskogean speakers occupying most of Mississippi, and the Caddoan-speaking Caddos and Wichitas living in East Texas. Despite residing in areas settled by different Europeans from Spain, France, and Great Britain, by 1783, when the United States took possession of much of the region, on paper at least, the Indians were still very numerous and not threatened by the American settlers until the second decade of the 19th century. Before I began writing my book, I had mistakenly thought that the Anglo-Protestant migration into the region had begun in earnest soon after the American Revolution, rather than really only beginning after the War of 1812. By 1815 or so, the native population stood at about 20,000 Cherokees, 20,000 Creeks, 5,000 Seminoles, 20,000 Choctaws, and 5,000 Chickasaws. 70,000 or so Indians residing in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. I want to apologize. I'm going to throw out a lot of numbers here, and you can forget them, but just this is key to my presentation. Although 250,000 Anglo-Americans and their slaves lived in Georgia, all of them resided in the eastern portion of the state, as the Cherokees and Creeks remained in possession of the western half of Georgia. In the other parts of the Gulf South, the Indian population was similar to that of the Euro-Americans, if not more numerous. In 1815, only about 1,000 Hispanics, Anglos, and French people resided in northwest Florida, mainly near Pensacola and San Marcos de Apalache, the two posts controlled by Spain. This was only 1/5 of the number of Seminoles. Only 7,000 Euro-Americans and slaves resided in what we now know as Alabama, a couple thousand French Catholics near Mobile, and about 5,000 Anglo-Protestants far to the north near Huntsville. Everything in between was considered Creek territory. The Natchez district of southwestern Mississippi contained about 30,000 people, half of them black slaves, while 25,000 Choctaws and Chickasaws controlled the entire rest of the territory. In Spanish Texas, the Indians greatly outnumbered the Euro-American inhabitants, especially after the province was racked by a civil war between 1812 and 1814. Whereas only about 100 Hispanic and French Catholics remained around Nacogdoches following the war, around 2,000 Caddos lived along the Louisiana-Texas frontier between the Neches and the Red Rivers, while another 2,000 or so Wichitas lived in towns located between the Brazos and the Trinity, most notably the Wacos, whose village stood at the confluence of the Bosque and the Brazos, where present-day Waco is today. By 1820, another 4,000 or so refugees from east of the Mississippi moved to East Texas to escape the influx of Anglo-Protestants. Half were the Creek offshoots known as the Alabama Cushatas, living in the big thicket north of Galveston Bay between the Trinity and the Neches. The other half established villages just northwest of Nacogdoches, led by the so-called Texas Cherokees, but also including Delawares, Shawnees, and Kickapoos, who had migrated from north of the Ohio River. Before 1815, none of the Euro-American powers, France, Spain, Great Britain, nor the United States, considered for a moment that it might be possible to remove these Indians from their lands. After 1763, Spain had abandoned the missionary efforts among the tribes and had adopted the French method of trading with the Indians, dealing with the Indians through trade. The United States, on the other hand, at this point, 1789 or so, developed a civilization program devised by President George Washington, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and Secretary of War Henry Knox, which optimistically hoped to transform the Native American men from hunters to commercial farmers who held their own private property. Theoretically, as the Indians settled down to become productive farmers and livestock raisers, they would need less land and as a result would happily sell their excess territory to the United States in exchange for trade goods and annuities, thus opening up that territory to Anglo settlers who would live side by side the natives who might one day become American citizens. By the outbreak of the War of 1812 and the Creek War of 1813-14, the United States had built roads throughout the Gulf South, but little land had actually been handed over to the Americans. The great turning point, however, was the March 1814 Battle of Horseshoe Bend, in which American forces from Tennessee, Georgia, and Mississippi, led by Andrew Jackson, and including such future Texans as Sam Houston and Davy Crockett, soundly defeated the anti-American Red Stick Upper Creeks, who had massacred a group of Anglo-Protestant settlers at Fort Mims, just north of Mobile, the prior August. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which occurred in the heart of Creek territory in central Alabama, was the first time that a Euro-American army had been able to defeat Gulf South Indians in their own homeland since settlement had begun in the late 17th century. The Chickasaws had turned back 2 French assaults on their towns near Tupelo, Mississippi in the 1730s, while the Wichitas had defeated a Spanish army on the Red River in Montague County, Texas in 1759. However, in the aftermath of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, the remaining Red Sticks fled to Spanish Florida to join their Seminole kinsmen, while other Creek refugees crowded together in the lower Creek towns located near present Columbus, Georgia, along the Chattahoochee River. For the most part, the Upper Creek settlements had been completely abandoned. Having defeated the Creeks, the United States moved boldly to take possession of their lands. In the late August 1814 Treaty of Fort Jackson, General Jackson forced the loyal White Stick Creeks to cede 23 million acres of land in southern Georgia and central Alabama as reparations for American expenses incurred in the war. The general then went forth and with a force of about 4,000 troops, consisting of United States soldiers, Tennessee and Kentucky volunteers, Louisiana French Creoles, and a free colored militia. Together, they defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815. Jackson's victories ended the threats from both the Creeks and the British, and thus allowed Anglo-Protestants to pour confidently into the region during the final half of the decade. The results were dramatic. Alabama's free population increased 14-fold to 100,000 or so in 1820, while the slave numbers grew at an even higher rate, growing from 2,500 to 47,000 in 10 years. Most of the settlers established plantations in the fertile land ceded by the Creeks in the Treaty of Fort Jackson. As a result of the Anglo influx, Alabama entered the Union as a state in December of 1819. Emboldened by his victories, Jackson forced the Choctaws and Chickasaws in 3 separate treaties following the Battle of New Orleans to cede land to the United States located in Mississippi and Tennessee. As a result, Mississippi's population more than doubled following the War of 1812, reaching 75,000 people, 33,000 of them black slaves. By 1820, most of them still residing near Natchez. Thus, Mississippi became a state in December of 1817. Nonetheless, both the Choctaws and Chickasaws still remained in possession of nearly half the territory located within Mississippi state boundaries. Freed from worries about an Indian uprising or a British invasion, the Americans now began to consider outright removal of the natives from these rich lands. In October 1820, Jackson negotiated the first treaty of removal with the Southern Indians. In the Treaty of Doak Stand, the Choctaws ceded 6 million acres of rich land, nearly 1/3 of their remaining territory, in the Delta region located between the Mississippi and Yazoo rivers, in return for 13 million acres, ultimately located between the Red and Canadian rivers in present Oklahoma, or Indian Territory. Despite the fact that few Choctaws relocated following the ratification of the agreement, the Treaty of Doak Stand would provide the model for the future removal of the Indians that remained east of the Mississippi River. Indians located outside the boundaries of the United States also succumbed to the might of Andrew Jackson. In early 1818, Jackson gathered an army of 3,000 men, many of them Tennesseans who had previously served with him, and joined 2,000 White Stick Creeks led by a mixed blood named William McIntosh, and invaded Spanish Florida to destroy Seminole towns located in the northwestern region located near present Tallahassee, forcing most of them to retreat southwestward towards central Florida near Gainesville. Less than a year later, Spain agreed to give up Florida to the United States in the Adam-Onis Treaty in return for maintaining possession of Texas, with the boundary being established at the Sabine and Red Rivers rather than at the Rio Grande, as President Jefferson had suggested following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. 2 years later, Mexico gained its independence from Spain, with the established border between Texas and Louisiana remaining in place. The treaty was not finally ratified until February 1821, following which Anglo-Protestant settlers, along with their slaves, continued to pour into the Gulf South, many intending to pursue the cultivation of cotton. Alabama experienced the greatest amount of growth as the white population nearly doubled to 190,000 during the 1820s, with the slave numbers almost tripling to reach 117,000. Mississippi lagged behind Alabama a bit as the white population rose from 42,000 in 1820 to 70,000 10 years later, with the slaves doubling to reach 65,000 in 1830. Although many of the migrants who moved to Alabama and Mississippi came from Georgia, that state's black and white population increased by 1/3 during the decade, with about 300,000 whites and 220,000 blacks residing there by 1830. Georgia also provided settlers for the newly acquired territory of Florida. Migration into Florida, however, was hindered by the 6,000 or so Seminoles who still resided in the north central portion of the territory. In September 1823, federal officials pressured 32 Seminole chiefs to sign the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, in which the tribe ceded 24 million acres in North Florida in exchange for 4 million located farther south. Anglo-Protestant settlers began to flood into the territory soon thereafter, and by 1830, the white population had grown to 27,000, with the slave numbers reaching 25,000. Whereas Florida had extraneous territory on which to relocate the Seminoles, the Anglo-Protestant residents of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi strongly desired the fertile lands that the 60,000 Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, and Chickasaws still possessed, but they had nowhere to send the tribes within the state boundaries. Consequently, President James Monroe proclaimed that his administration planned on removing all the eastern Indians to the region west of the Mississippi River in order to open up their territory to white cultivators. As a result, in February 1825, American officials met with the Creek mixed blood William McIntosh, and, in return for a large bribe, he signed a treaty which ceded all the tribe's holdings in Georgia and about 2/3 of their remaining lands in Alabama in exchange for territory west of the Mississippi River. The Creek National Council, not surprisingly, responded by finding McIntosh guilty of the tribal law forbidding the unauthorized sale of land and ordered his execution, which was carried out in April of 1825. Georgia Governor George Troup, whose private secretary, and this is key, was future Texas President Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar, protested the execution of McIntosh and threatened to invade Creek country with state militia to arrest the council members. In order to defuse the explosive situation, the newly inaugurated president, John Quincy Adams, met with the Creeks in Washington and signed a treaty in which the tribe gave up all their lands in Georgia while maintaining their territory in Alabama, and being granted land between the Arkansas and Canadian rivers west of Arkansas Territory. Because the situation remained so tense, when Andrew Jackson became president in March 1829, he recommended legislation calling for the negotiation of removal treaties with all the eastern tribes, in which they would give up their lands in exchange for reservations in the Indian Territory to be established west of Arkansas and Missouri. Despite intense opposition to the Indian Removal Act by Northern legislators, it passed both houses with full Southern support and was signed into law in May of 1830. Secretary of War John Eaton negotiated the first removal treaty with the Choctaws in September 1830, in which the tribe ceded their last remaining 10 million acres in Mississippi to the United States in return for their lands in the newly created Indian Territory. By the end of 1833, nearly 18,000 Choctaws had moved there, 2,000 or so having perished on the Trail of Tears. Although the Chickasaws signed a removal treaty in October 1832, the 5,000 tribal members did not abandon Mississippi and move westward until 1837. By this time, the Seminoles in Florida, led by the Creek mixed-blood Osceola, had begun fighting back in protest of their 1832 removal treaty, leading to the Second Seminole War, which lasted until 1842, when most of the tribe was forced to surrender and move to Oklahoma. Fearing that the 15,000 Creeks remaining in Alabama might join their Seminole brethren, the United States Army rounded them up and moved them to Indian Territory north of the Choctaws in 1836 and 1837. Finally, despite taking their case to the United States Supreme Court, the Cherokees gave in, and between 1837 and 1838, they endured their Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. Within a quarter of a century of the fateful Battle of Horseshoe Bend, then, almost all the Indians, except for a few stragglers who hid out in isolated areas, had been removed from the Gulf South east of the Mississippi River. During this period, the United States also negotiated a treaty of removal with the Caddo Indians of Louisiana. President Jackson's appointee as Indian agent to the Caddos signed a treaty with them in July 1835, in which the remaining 500 or so Caddos still residing in Louisiana would join their brethren in Mexican Texas by the following July. In the meantime, numerous Anglo-Protestants, along with their black slaves, had migrated to Texas, despite it being outside the United States and in Mexican hands. By 1830, nearly 8,000 Anglo-Protestants and 1,000 slaves had established settlements in Texas east of the Brazos. These settlers, many of them having migrated from the Gulf South, acted in a fashion similar to their brethren in the United States when it came to the province's Native Americans. Beginning in 1830, the same year as the passage of the Indian Removal Act, Anglo-Protestant settlers, in conjunction with Mexican forces from San Antonio and the Texan Cherokee immigrants living near Nacogdoches, began attacking the Wichita settlements between the Brazos and the Trinity, resulting in the burning and the abandonment of the Waco village on the Bosque. By 1835, most of the Wichitas had retreated north of the Red River into U.S.-controlled Indian Territory, establishing villages near the Wichita Mountains in present southwestern Oklahoma. Other Wichitas moved to the upper Brazos Valley west of present Fort Worth, far from the Anglo-Protestant settlements in Texas. By this time, the number of Anglo-Protestants in Texas had risen to 30,000 or so, and conflict with the Mexican government broke out in October 1835, just 2 months prior to the Seminole uprising in Florida. In the winter of 1835 and 1836, Mexico and Texas sent representatives to the Texas Cherokee village near Nacogdoches in hope of gaining their allegiance in the upcoming war. By now, Cherokee Chief Duwale, who's this guy here, or Chief Bowl as the Texans knew him, claimed to act as spokesman for all of the 6,000 or so Indians living in East Texas. Although he made no commitment to the Mexicans, on February 23, 1836, Duwale signed a treaty with the Texas Commission, headed by Sam Houston, in which the so-called associated bands were granted a reservation lying north of the road to San Antonio, located between the Sabine and Neches rivers, in return for pledging neutrality in the war with Mexico. On March 2, 1836, only a week after this agreement had been signed, the Texans declared independence, formulated a constitution, and established a provisional government for Texas until the Constitution could be adopted. Despite the fact that the provisional government did not consider the Cherokee Treaty for ratification, the Indians of East Texas remained on the sidelines until the war surprisingly ended with a Texas victory at the Battle of San Jacinto on April 21st. Nonetheless, many of the victorious Texans remained suspicious of the Indians' relations with the Mexican government and were definitely envious of the lands that the Cherokees and their allies maintained despite the lack of the treaty's ratification. Despite the anti-Indian sentiments of most of the Texans, in October 1836, newly inaugurated President Sam Houston proposed establishing peace with the tribes through trade and resubmitted the Cherokee Treaty to the Texas Senate for ratification. Despite his wishes, in December 1837, just as the Chickasaws, Creeks, and Eastern Cherokees were in the process of being removed to Indian territory, the Texas Senate nullified the Cherokee Treaty. As a result, many Indians in East Texas were open to a Mexican effort led by Vicente Cordova to form an alliance aimed at ejecting the Anglo-Protestants from the province. This plan, known as the Cordova Rebellion, was uncovered in August 1838, and a Texan force dispersed the army of 300 Indians that had gathered outside Nacogdoches. Less than a month later, on September 3rd, 1838, Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar, late of Georgia, a proven foe to the Indians, was elected president of Texas. In his first message to Congress, Lamar used Jacksonian-type rhetoric by announcing that the time had come for, quote, the prosecution of an exterminating war on Texas Indian warriors, which will admit no compromise and have no termination except in their total extinction or their total expulsion. Although Lamar was not inaugurated until December 10th, 1838, his election had immediate repercussions as the Texans began to aggressively attack the Indians of East Texas. On October 14, 1838, Thomas Jefferson Rusk led an attack upon the Kickapoo village on the Trinity River, where many of the Cordova Rebellion Indians had gathered, dispersing most of the Indians westward. Feeling threatened by the Texans, most of the Caddos of East Texas abandoned their ancient homeland near Nacogdoches and joined their Wichita brethren far to the west. However, the Caddo group that had signed the Treaty of Removal with the United States in July of 1835 retreated back to the American side of the border, only to be pursued by Rusk, who crossed the international boundary line and disarmed the Caddos near Shreveport. Soon thereafter, these Caddos joined with the rest of their Caddoan-speaking brethren and took refuge north of the Red River in Indian Territory. By early 1839, then, only 1,000 or so Cherokees, Delawares, and Shawnees remained in northeast Texas, while less than half that amount of Alabamas and Coushatta's continued to reside in the big thicket of southeastern Texas, most having fled the state to join their fellow Creeks who had just arrived in Oklahoma. Finding evidence of Texas Cherokee involvement in the Cordova Rebellion, President Lamar delivered an ultimatum to Chief Diwali, ordering him to move his tribe north to the Indian Territory or to be destroyed. When the Cherokees hesitated, on July 15, 1839, Texan forces killed Chief Diwali and destroyed the remaining Cherokee and Delaware villages near Nacogdoches. Soon thereafter, the Republic of Texas signed their own treaty of removal with the Shawnees, forcing that tribe to join the refugees who had relocated to the United States territory north of the Red River. Encouraged by the events in northeastern Texas, citizens along the lower Trinity and Neches rivers acted on their own to try and force the region's few remaining Indians from their midst. By early 1840, only a few hundred Indians were still living in the Alabama and Coushatta villages when the Texas Congress passed an act for establishing small reservations for these tribes in the Big Thicket, an area considered unfit for cultivation. As with the rest of the Gulf South, Texas had removed all of its Indians, except for a few stragglers, from its borders by 1840. Although the Comanches still provided Texas with a very formidable foe, as witnessed by the Great Comanche Raid in the summer of 1840, the Texans soon made peace with the tribe, whose territory was actually located far to the west of the Anglo-Protestant settlements anyway. The Texans thereafter were able to help redirect Comanche raiders south of the Rio Grande instead, softening up Mexico for the American invasion that took place with the outbreak of war with Mexico in 1846. As with the rest of the Gulf South, the lack of Indian threat opened up Texas to the same large-scale settlement that had occurred in Alabama and Mississippi. By 1845, when Texas entered the Union, the Anglo-Protestant population had tripled to about 90,000 residents in the state, living alongside 40,000 or so slaves. Like the rest of the Gulf states, the Anglo-Protestants of Texas had forcibly removed the native inhabitants, had brought in large numbers of slaves, and had brought in large numbers of slaves to establish commercial plantations. Perceiving a threat to the racial status quo from the federal government with the election of a Republican as president of the United States in November of 1860, the Anglo-Protestants of Texas did not hesitate to join with their fellow Gulf states and secede from the Union to create the Confederate States of America prior to Abraham Lincoln's inauguration on March 4th, 1861. The states, which had shared such a similar history since 1815, particularly in the areas of slavery and Indian removal, would now share the same fate of defeat in the Civil War, along with the woes caused by Reconstruction and the establishment of Jim Crow in the late 19th century. Not until the 20th century would Texas be able to separate itself from the shared history of the Gulf South and become the Lone Star State that we all know and love today. Thank you.
Well, you can see that things get complicated real fast around the turn of the 19th century. Well, we are actually running a couple of minutes ahead of time, and so we are about to take what will be a half-hour break. We will reassemble promptly at 11:15 for our post-break presentation, which will take us to the other side of the story. If we saw the Anglo side of the movement into Texas a moment ago, we will see the Indian perspective on all of this after the break. So please be back at 11:15. Thank you.